tried to get research grants. My first 9 were rejected. And then a lot of my friends said I should, apply for faculty jobs, but no chemical engineering department in the world would hire me. They all said this biological stuff I was doing didn't make any sense for a chemical engineering department, that I should be doing oil or something like that. So I didn't get any jobs. Eventually, I got one in a nutrition department. And the reason I got it was the head of the department was kind of a benevolent dictator kind of department head. He liked me and offered me the job. But he didn't bother to ask anybody else in the department what they thought. Now, that might have been okay, except for one thing, which is the year after I joined the department, he left. And then a lot of the senior faculty decided to give me advice, and their advice is I should leave too. In fact, on the next slide, this is from a good friend of mine, Mike Marletta, who is a very famous chemist, member of the National Academy and head of Berkeley's chemistry department for many years. And here he was describing what it was like to be with me in 1979. I'll just read it. He said, one evening he went to a faculty dinner at a Chinese restaurant with me and some senior professors. He said, a senior scientist sat quizzing us while smoking a cigar. He said, when the older scientist heard my concepts for drug delivery, he blew a cloud of smoke in my face and said, you better start looking for another job. So this was all very discouraging, but I really believed in what I was doing, so I kept trying. And we not only did make the nanoparticles and microparticles, but, and I'm going to show you a bloody slide, but there's no other way to show this, but we were able to use it to isolate the very first blood vessel inhibitors and provide ways for people to do this all in the future. And the next slide shows that. This is from a paper we wrote in Science in 1976, and we did maybe 2,000 eyes on the left of controls, and all of them, you got the sheet of blood vessels, as you see, and the tumors always grew. But on the right, look at how different that is. The blood vessels are sparser, they're lower, they avoid the tumor. And this showed that you could actually stop blood vessels and could even stop tumor growth in animals. Now, medicine isn't fast. It took another 28 years and great work from companies like Genentech before the first blood vessel inhibitors were approved. But on the next slide, what you see is starting 28 years after that Science paper, one after the next blood vessel inhibitor is approved by FDA. Avastin, the first of these, is maybe the second or third largest biotech drug from a sales standpoint in history. And there are many, many others that have led to all kinds of treatment for cancer, different cancers, and also for diseases of blindness in the back of the eye, like macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy. And these drugs, like Eylea and Lucentis, are also multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drugs. And the approvals continue all the time. Another thing that we did and that was unusual in the 1970s was file a patent. Children's Hospital had never had one where I was working. But Dr. Folkman and I filed one, and 5 years in a row, it got rejected. And everybody told me to give up at the hospital. They said the examiner will never allow it. But I don't like to give up, as you can probably tell by now. So I tried to think, as I told you in the beginning, everybody told us this was impossible. It could never work. I wondered whether anybody wrote this down. So after 5 years of rejection, in 1982, I did a literature search. And the next slide shows one of the things I found, because I thought maybe somebody wrote this down. And I found out, and I had no idea this was written, that these 5 famous scientists described the field in 1979. They said generally the agent to be released is a relatively small molecule with a molecular weight no larger than a few hundred. One would not expect that macromolecules could be released by such a technique because of their extremely small permeation rates. However, Folkman and myself have reported some surprising is a really good word for a patent examiner, that clearly demonstrate the opposite. So I showed that to the people at the hospital. They showed it to the patent examiner. He said, gee, he had no idea. But he said, if Dr. Langer can get written affidavits, written statements from each of these 5 people, he would allow it. So I wrote them, and they were nice enough to write me back that they really wrote it. And on the next slide, we got this really broad patent. And with that, we would license it to companies. We'd teach companies. And now, based on this, there's many, many products based on these ideas, all used by hundreds of millions of people all over the world. Some pictures are shown on the next slide. And what you see are everything from Lupron Depot, which Takeda's developed, which are little microspheres you inject to deliver molecules to treat advanced prostate cancer, endometriosis. On the bottom right, you see drug-eluting stents, but these are used to treat all kinds of diseases, opioid addiction, mental health diseases, bleeding, and so forth. Now, one of the issues, we keep on going back and forth between academia and trying to get these to patients, but one of the issues when you make tiny particles is they also can stick together. So one of the other things we did, next slide, and this was with Vladimir Torchelin and others, and we published this in Science almost 30 years ago, is make a coating that would prevent that aggregation and also would prevent foreign cells from eating these little particles. And that's with polyethylene glycol. And let me just show you a video on the next slide explaining how this works.
He starts with a nanoparticle of anti-cancer drug. That gets encased in a plastic that releases the drug over time. That in turn gets a special wrapping that disguises the package as a water molecule to fool the body's immune system. And last but not least, the address where it should be delivered, a key that will only fit the lock of cancer cells.
Now, I should tell you that the clinicians I work with tell me it really doesn't blow the cell up that way, but I think you get the idea. And you could use this for small molecules, but also for siRNA, and as I'm going to now tell you, messenger RNA. And with respect to that, next slide. In 2010, Derek Rossi, Nubar Fayan, Ken Chen, and myself had this idea that we could make a company to do messenger RNA therapeutics. Now, by this time, protein therapeutics had become quite successful, but it takes a long time to make protein therapeutics or vaccines. Like, think about eggs, you have to start a year in advance to make a flu vaccine. But with messenger RNA, you could actually have the body be a factory. You could just take the messenger RNA, put it in a nanoparticle, and inject it into the body, and the body will do all the work. And not only that, but on the next slide, what you could do is treat diseases you could never treat before, like intracellular or membrane-bound proteins that are effective. So let me just give you some examples of this. We started in 2010 and started this company, Moderna. By early 2020, we had 13 products in clinical trials. None had been approved. And then, as you know, COVID hit. But I want to show you the timeline to give you an idea of how powerful this technology is. Next slide. So the Chinese scientists published the virus genetic sequence on January 11th. It took less than 2 days for the Moderna scientists to finalize the messenger RNA design. It put it in the nanoparticles, but in February, we'd already had it made and sent to NIH for testing, and the first patients were treated just within another month. So just about 4 days, and then we were able to start clinical trials. And within another 2 months, now May of 2020, we actually had the first data on that. And I thought it was very exciting, so did everybody at Moderna. But nonetheless, the press and many scientists were very negative. Let me just show you the headlines of the Boston Globe, my local newspaper, which is seen all over the world, what they did now on May 19th, 2020. Next slide. And what they said, this is not how you do science, with my picture underneath it. Now, I want to go 6 months after that. 6 months after that, we'd completed what's called the phase 3 trial. It was 30,000 patients. 15,000 get treated, and 15,000 get a placebo. Of those 15,000 that were treated, and I remember being in the room when we broke the code that November of 2020, of those 15,000, not a single one died, not a single one went to the hospital, and it was 94% effective. And this is now approved and used all over the world. The next slide just shows you a picture of that vaccine. And the next slide shows you some of the data that you can tremendously prevent hospitalizations. This is from the Mayo Clinic, Center for Disease Control. And you can see that boosters also help tremendously. And the next slide is from the Mayo Clinic that just shows the different vaccines' effectiveness, that the Moderna one was the most effective, but Pfizer and BioNTech also using nanoparticles with messenger RNA were also quite effective. And finally, on the very last slide, is that you don't have to limit this just to COVID. In fact, this could be useful for any vaccine, maybe any therapeutic. And what Moderna recently, along with Merck, noted is in a phase 2 trial with 157 patients with advanced melanoma, what we did is create a personalized cancer vaccine. You do that by looking at the top 34 mutations in the patient's cancer cells. You take that genetic code and you create an mRNA vaccine in the same way that was done with COVID vaccines, just putting the mRNA in nanoparticles to protect it. Then you inject it into these patients, and every patient gets a different one based on what their neoepitopes are. So it's very personalized. And what we did in the trial is half get Keytruda. That's a major immunotherapy drug. It's been incredibly effective. And half get Keytruda puts this personalized cancer vaccine. And amazingly, the data were quite remarkable. The risk of recurrence or death was reduced by 44%. And actually, Moderna also now has published, cited using this for RSV vaccines. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg of what I hope we'll see for modern medicine. Thank you so much again for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Professor Langer, for joining us virtually. We apologize for the technical glitch in the video for a while. Now, we would like to begin with the CEO Conclave panel discussion. For that, I would like to invite the moderator of the session, Ms. Shireen Bhan, Managing Director, CNBC TV 18, on the stage and introduce the esteemed panelists. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here for what promises to be a very interesting conversation. Hopefully a provocative conversation is what I would like it to be here at the CEO Conclave at BioAsia. I was just recounting my past experiences here at BioAsia. I think this is perhaps the 10th or the 11th time that I've done the CEO Conclave here at BioAsia, so it feels great to be back here amongst you. Without further ado, let me welcome our panelists on stage. If they could join me here, Satish Reddy, Chairman of Dr. Reddy's. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our panelists here this evening. Nandini Piramal, Chairperson of Piramal Pharma. Mahima Datta, the Managing Director of Biological E, Glenn Saldana, the Chairman of Glenmark Pharma, and Hari Bhartia, the Founder and Co-Chairman of Jubilant Bhartia. Our esteemed panel this evening as we kick off the CEO Conclave. And as they get seated here, the context of what we hope to discuss is what the future engines of growth could potentially be for the Indian pharmaceutical industry. A lot has been said in the past 2 years, especially post the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, my apologies, the minister, the man behind all of this, Mr. K.T. Ramarao, please do join us on stage. Thank you very much. Cheers. For that, I should be struck off stage altogether, but apologies. So again, as I was saying, let me set the context for the conversation that we intend to have here. Through the course of the pandemic, there's been a lot of focus and a lot of attention on the Indian pharmaceutical industry. But more importantly, I think the question now is how do we move, and this is a conversation that I was having with the minister earlier today, how do we move from volume to value? And this is not a new conversation for any of you here in this room. I think this is something that the pharma industry and the CEOs here on this panel have been grappling with. We have seen some changes being made, but there is a long distance to go. So without further ado, let me get the minister to kickstart on that. To carry forward the conversation that we were having this morning on what it will actually take to create an enabling environment for the Indian pharma sector to move from volume to value, and where do you believe we stand in that journey today?
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you for this opportunity. No, I was actually made a part of the panel just to listen in, actually. I mean, I think I wanted to hear from the captains of the industry on what they would like to see, happen in the states, at the center, and how a state like Telangana can actually do policy advocacy in terms of what the industry wants and how possibly we can get a few things done for them. But having said that, I think, just to give my state's perspective, my city's perspective, um, Telangana today, in fact, is one of the leading powerhouses of life sciences in the world, not just in India. As I was mentioning earlier, not only pharmaceuticals, but vaccines, biotech, and then we have medtech, and now health tech. I think all of these areas, Telangana continues to be a very, very dominant player with the who's who of the industry from across the world, making it one of their most important hubs. But like you said, if we have to move from volume to value approach, I think the three key things. One, innovation. I think that is extremely important because as we move forward, we see lots of innovation coming in the form of, as Vas was mentioning this morning, augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. I think that's going to be one of the key things. Secondly, we have to operate on scale if we really have to ensure that we compete with the large manufacturing countries of the world, destinations of the world. We have to operate and think on scale. And thirdly, most importantly, I think IP protection and regulatory data framework that is required from the government side to make sure that any innovator feels confident that they can do business in India without having to worry about data security or data being taken away, or their patent laws not being infringed upon. So I think these three things together, innovation, IP protection, and of course operating on scale, I think these three things will really make a huge difference.
Yes, I would imagine that they will make a big difference, but let's address each one of them because there are whole chapters in themselves. And let's start with the issue of innovation. Satish Reddy, I'll start by talking to you. As I pointed out, this is not new. We've been discussing this on how we can move up the value chain for several years now. Now, as you look at this as a potential engine of growth, what are the constraints today? Is it capital? Is it capability? Is it confidence? What is holding back this move up the value chain?
Thanks, Shireen. So definitely I don't think there is any issue when it comes to capability, because India has proven that when it comes to innovation, in terms of its ability to discover drugs, it's already proven that it has the capabilities. I think what is required is, partly the first one, the capital part of it, in the sense that what you need to create is an ecosystem, right? So, and what I mean by that is, as you know, this kind of research is risky. There are just very few products which make it to the market, and if companies need to take the risk, because most of us are actually listed companies, even the people you see on stage here, we all run listed companies, and we also have to show a return. So, in terms of how much we can spend and the kind of risk that we need to take, it's always something that we keep calibrating. That's the large company perspective. But then if you again see startups, if you see from that perspective, the VCs have to step in. And if you talk to them, they will come in at a later stage. So who funds the early stage? So this is where we keep asking the government to also pitch in to work on, say, 2-3 fronts. One would be to say, especially, can you create a joint fund so that the VCs can come in? That's one part of it. So that at least you get started somewhere, and this is a model practiced in certain other countries like Israel, for example, would have this kind of system. The other side, we also say that, it's like when it comes to funding institutions, and that's a much bigger question to come up later, what exactly can be done in that particular space so that we can spur research, so that between industry academics there is some kind of a collaboration, and then you can create that kind of an ecosystem. The bigger thing would be regulatory revamp. I think that needs to be done. So if you ask me about what are the gaps, these are the kind of gaps. If filled in, I think it will actually boost the confidence. It will bring in the necessary capital so that companies can take more risk across the spectrum, all the way from startups to small scale companies to medium scale to even large companies.
Okay, KT Ramarao, let me get you to respond to the capital question, and if the government can play a role there at all. And to the VC point, because you do deal with VCs as well, since you are dealing with the startup ecosystem, why is that, in your assessment, you believe that VCs are more comfortable spending billions of dollars on 10-minute deliveries, but not on a sector like this?
No, in fact, I've been a huge champion and huge advocate. In fact, Satish knows this more than anybody else, of government incentivizing research and development. We have to. I don't think we have the luxury, because if you look at the world, you just heard Professor Robert Langer speaking. He's a professor at MIT. In the US and all the Western countries, in fact, the universities spend billions of dollars in terms of research opportunities, in terms of the kind of grants they get. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of a similar kind in India. So therefore, at least the least you can do is, when the private sector is investing heavy money into research and development, the least you can do is actually incentivize them to come out with more and more innovation. It could be a startup, or it could be a large global MNC, Indian MNC, which has done truly well. So I've been a huge champion, and in fact, I've been making a case with the government of India for the same as well.
Well, let me get each one of you to address the capital question. Hari Bhartiya, let me start by asking you, how do we sort this out? If we are talking about engines of growth, and we believe that innovation is going to be one of the key engines of growth for this pharmaceutical industry in India to move from $40–50 billion to how do we address the capital question that continues to be on the table as a constraint?
Yeah, thanks, Shireen. And firstly, before I answer your question, let me thank you, Minister, for inviting me.
Thank you.
First time is in BioAsia. So, when I was a young chemical engineer, that was 40 years back, for us, Hyderabad was RRL Hyderabad and IDPL. They were the two really kind of initial startups in India. We used to look for people from IDPL and used to do research work, because it was brilliant research. And if you look at that with two and maybe few more industries, that was the start. And look what an ecosystem it has come to. And I was listening to the minister, almost 40% of generics are made out of this Telangana. And in terms of vaccine volumes, we are about 30%. That's what
35%.
35% of the vaccine
Of
volumes
global
of
vaccines.
global
Yeah.
is being made here. Coming back to your question on capital constraints, see, there are two ways to look at innovation. One is very early. This kind of work is not blue sky, but I would say, let's say in pharma terms, call it target discovery. This is done really in academia. Now, where does academia get money? Now, they need to get grants. And those grants, if you look at US system, you get NIH, and there are other government agencies which give grants for the very early stage research. So in India, the grants do come from the Ministry of Biotech, but that grant level has to be increased. The second, so if you have good early stage research in academia or institutions, you will start to get that, because they file patents, it will come to the industry, and industry then picks it up for their early stage research. And I think in India, capability, especially for, if you divide pharma into three areas, small molecules, biotherapeutics, or innovative like CAR-T cell, that's very advanced. So small molecule, I think India has full capability. And even for monoclonal antibodies, early stage research, we have full capabilities here. And the only thing which we lack in terms of capital is what Satish mentioned. When you translate it into clinic, that's when big bucks come in. So two ways to build that up. In US, the biotech ecosystem is very powerful. Now, that ecosystem of biotech has not come in. The tech part has come in. And I can see them coming in now, because you're starting to see Indian companies sometimes taking their early stage research and going to US and getting it funded. So that funding is starting to happen. Even companies like, I can name many companies from India who have done it. So the way for Indian companies to get into this game is two ways. If I take another minute to explain it to you. One is, take it to proof of concept and then partner and license with big pharma. Because big pharma's capability to commercialize the drug is huge. So that way you get an early entry, you get experience, and then when it comes to after success, you can then build on it. So that is the first way to do it. The other way is to sell the product at an early stage. So that you recover some money, go back and do some more research. So the capital problem can only be solved by partnering with big pharma at the initial level. And if I look at some of the companies now are taking it fully also. Like in nuclear medicine, there is one drug in cancer, we are doing a full clinical, but because it's not $1 billion drug, it's I would say it's a $100 million drug. So we can do it. But when it comes to $1 billion drug and taking risk, I think we have still some room to go.
Glenn Saldana, I want you to come in on that and take us through the Glenmark example of how you've been actually able to address it, because you've taken forward one of the models that we just heard there from Hari Bhartiya.
So Shireen, good evening. We've been working in innovation now for 23 years, right? So it's been a long journey for us. We've had quite a lot of success. So we've done, 7 licensing deals around the way, got $300 million of cash by licensing our own intellectual property. We spun out our biologics company called Ichnos Sciences, a US biotech. We work in monoclonal antibodies, so bispecific, multispecific antibodies in Ichnos. In Glenmark, we do small molecule research. So we've had a long journey in innovation. We still don't have a drug on the market, but we have several late-stage assets, both in oncology, immunology, and it's a long journey. Innovation is a very, very long journey, right? It's been 22, 23 years for us, right? And while we've had successes in terms of discovery, inventions, licensing, we've seen it all, right? Except for having a drug on the market. And we're hoping, this next decade will be the decade where we could actually bring something to market, right? Which is truly novel and world-class. So that's what we are shooting for. But I think the ecosystem of innovation is critical, right? And I think India, today is now starting to build that ecosystem, right? Whether it's at the government level through research-linked incentive schemes, or getting its regulatory systems together, so there are multiple changes happening in India which we think, this decade should look very promising in terms of actually coming up with something novel out of the country.
Nandini, come in on that. This could potentially be the decade that could prove to be the inflection point in this journey?
Yes, I think India needs to also take advantage of some of its, natural assets. We've got very, very skilled people, a lot of whom have been now in industry, both in India and outside. And if you look at what China did, where they actually recruited people who'd worked outside to come back and actually start companies, we've got our people are some of the best in the world. I also think that in an era of China plus one, where people are beginning to think that they need to do innovation somewhere other than China, India is also a great place to do that.
Mahima?
Thanks for that. I think I'll
You just have to move the mic a little closer. Yeah.
Is this better?
That's better.
Okay. I think most of what I want to say is just complementary to everything that's been said already, but I do want to offer a slightly different perspective, because I think innovation is much more nuanced and complex than is, just commonly understood. And I think the first aspect is, if you take a step back, and there is this great intention to increase R&D spending, right, to get it to 15%. But if you look at the top 25 pharma companies in India, barring a few outliers, and let's exclude them, their profitability is between 13 and 15% after they spend 5 to 6% in R&D spending. So how do we create the headspace to increase R&D spending? And as the Honorable Minister rightly pointed out, I don't think investors and shareholders are ready to reward a model that's considered high risk, long gestation period, right? And obviously, as an investor, from that perspective, you want to make sure this well-performing, stable pharma company is earning you better returns than your money in the bank. That's why you invest. So I think, one, it's important to acknowledge that. And the second in my mind, which is much more strategic and is much more of an instrumental issue, is the lack of a robust domestic market for novel products. And this is a reflection of two things. I think the lack of health insurance coverage. You know, it's 30–40% in our country, but even that is misleading because it's moderate. The cap is very low. It doesn't, even this 30–40% doesn't allow for your mRNA therapies, your gene therapies, any kind of innovative product. Yeah. And we don't have a procurement mechanism like the NHS or the CDC that provides you an opportunity to make these kinds of novel therapeutics accessible. So if you're saying, well, it's okay to be innovative, just discover a product, but export it or make it available only to those who can afford it, that's a different business model. And that could be a pure play CDMO opportunity. And if that's the case, I think we're already well positioned. There are a lot of companies that make innovative products, that pure play CDMO. And for that, we don't need capital. We need some reform in regulatory process streamlining, maybe some FDI policy flexibility. But we're already really well positioned, and I think capital availability for that type of business model is widely available because it's understood, it's demonstrated to be successful. So if you have the track record, I don't think access to capital is an issue. The former model, where you need to do innovation to create products that can be consumed domestically, I think that needs a lot more. The demand for that is driven by policy intervention.
Yeah.
And once you have a captive domestic market, then you can even attract investors into the discovery model. Because otherwise you're saying to them, choose India over a discovery company in the US, you know, to innovate. And I'm not sure what the value proposition there would be.
You know, thank you very much, Mahima, for bringing a very interesting aspect to this conversation, and that's what I want the panel here to comment on. And I think a lot of time and focus is spent on what's happening as far as the export story is concerned, because we have positioned ourselves as the pharmacy of the world. I think we spend more time talking about the generic market crashing in the US than we talk about developing the domestic market. So let's address that issue. And Satish Reddy, let me start by talking to you about the domestic market opportunity. And where do you see it over the next 5 years?
In India?
Yeah.
No, certainly if you see the growth of the pharmaceutical industry in India, it's been tremendous compared to, you know, where we were just a few years ago. And the potential is on several folds. You know, if you see one, of course, in terms of the lifestyle kind of diseases, you know, as the time passes by, you see that has one wave of growth. And also I think in terms of the kind of companies that operate in this market, that itself has undergone quite a bit of a change. And then in terms of, you know, even from the kind of products that we used to have, that we're able to provide, biosimilars, for example.
Right.
That's a big area of growth, and India has been quite prolific in terms of being able to, Indian companies I mean to say, they've been quite prolific in terms of the launches that they've come out with, and that continues. So in terms of the opportunity for growth, that still continues in terms of where we are. One, when it comes to the health system in itself in this country, the healthcare infrastructure, and also the digital, you know, kind of interventions that are now happening in healthcare itself. You know, the telemedicine, in terms of e-pharmacies, in terms of, you know, the artificial intelligence and its use in, you know, various disciplines of medicine. It's a whole huge of opportunity in terms of, you know, how diagnosis is done, how treatment is done. That's one part of it in terms of, you know, how people are getting treated. COVID itself, you know, post-COVID has also made health and wellness as a prime issue in everybody's life at this point of time. And also added to that, the government's interventions, you know, especially through, you know, the health mission, the Arogya Bharat scheme, the health ID coming in. All these are catalysts which will make sure that, you know, in terms of health and the way it's going to be dealt with in the country is going to be very different from what it was in the past. The response from the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the therapeutics, in terms of the kind of plans that they've made, also in terms of digital interventions which even pharmaceutical companies have made during this COVID times. All this, I think, puts us in a good position, and we certainly see the growth in industry. It will continue to be in double digits, for sure.
Double-digit growth is what you're anticipating. Hari Bhartia, come in on that. There have been policy interventions, both on the insurance side with the Ayushman Bharat program as well as the digital health mission and so on and so forth. But how do you see the domestic market evolving? What's the 5-year roadmap, if you were to look out, that you believe we could get to?
Yeah. So, I'm not an expert on the domestic market, but I can tell you, I see the market exploding from every point of view. Because more and more people are getting insured, and the government insurance scheme also is encouraging more infrastructure in the hospitals because they get paid. But I want to your point of innovation that you asked, I think that can be applied to the Indian market, and I want to give you a story on this. That, you know, most of the drugs, because what we are looking to is bring innovative drugs in India at a very low cost. I think that will open up the market hugely, because today Indian patient does not have access to highly innovative drugs because they are very expensive when launched in US. Now what happens is, when a target is validated and you have the first drug which is approved in US, you have an opportunity to bring follow-on drugs on the same target. Now the follow-on drugs can be, as an Indian company, you can bring it in India. Now what the constraint is the clinical trial. You know, why the clinical trial approval takes so much time in India? A drug which is discovered in India, you know, in US, you file for an IND, they have a 30-day window. On the 30th day, they approve it. If there's no communication, and most of the time, within 60 days, you get an approval. In India, it takes a lot of time. So one way to bring innovation, and China has done that. If you study what Chinese are doing right now, they are discovering drugs for China, not for US market. We need to discover drugs for India, for Indian patients, and do the trials on Indian patients. That way you can bring the price down to 1/20th or even 1/50th in many cases. So I would say that is a big opportunity for the Indian market.
And that's an interesting aspect that I want Glenn, Nandini and Mahima to come in on, and then I'll get the minister to comment as well. And Glenn, let me start by talking to you. I think what I've heard from each one of you is that amongst the challenges that require redressal is the regulatory revamp, the regulatory re-architecture, so to speak. From this opportunities point of view that Hari Bhartia just spoke of, what do you think are the next steps? What are the imperatives, especially since we have a access as well as affordability deficit that we need to address?
Well, I think, you know, the first step is, I mean, government has to play an important role in reimbursing expensive products coming out of India. That will create an ecosystem. China did pretty much the same thing. Basically, China actually promoted their local innovation by the government reimbursing products, expensive products, right, patent protected products through their system. So there has to be some reimbursement system for Indian developed innovative products, right, which is obviously will be compared to the world benchmarks and will be at a premium to the generic or the branded generics drugs available in India. So I think that will be one mega change which I think is essential if you want to kickstart the Indian innovation system. Outside of that, I think the government is doing a lot through the RLI schemes, PLI schemes, trying to promote the industry and promote innovation. And there are lots of new things in the works to promote the ecosystem. Also at the regulatory level, there are quite a few reforms the government is doing. So there are lots of good things happening today, but the one thing missing is the domestic market, right? And China has actually created that domestic market, right? And that has actually kick-started a lot of their innovation because their domestic drugs get reimbursed, right, by the government, especially in some high-end oncology and some unmet medical needs. So that's a critical element, I feel.
addressing the missing domestic market, what do you believe are the imperatives, Nandini, as we look ahead?
I think I'd like to add one more is reforming our public health system, because I think with COVID we also learnt about the gaps in our public health system, and especially also the middle management there. I think with the digitization of health records and things like that, I think you can actually make a difference and have more continuity of care, because sometimes when you're a person, you as a patient, you get thrown around by all the different doctors and all the different hospitals that you have to go to. So actually having that linked up care, I think, will also help patients.
Mahima, on the issue of reimbursement, and I want to use the vaccine example as an example of where the gaps really lie in the government being able to come to the support and the aid. COVID was a very different time because governments around the world rallied behind pharmaceutical companies. You were one of the companies that did get a grant from the government to also develop and market your COVID-19 vaccine. But where do you believe, in light of that experience, the gaps lie as far as this reimbursement is concerned? And do you believe that that's going to be a viable option in the Indian context going forward?
Yeah, actually, Shireen, I have to say in the vaccine industry, we've been incredibly lucky because the value of immunization is well recognized in our country and across the world. So majority of the pediatric vaccines are fully funded and reimbursed or given freely by the government, right? All of the mandatory vaccines. And the government policy has again been extremely strong because it's the most cost-effective health intervention available to you. So they've been able to introduce new vaccines. They're rolling out pneumococcal vaccine, conjugate vaccine. They've announced HPV, human papilloma virus. Rotavirus is fully introduced. They're considering large-scale campaigns for typhoid, MR. All of them are fully introduced. So in the vaccine industry, we're very fortunate that when you say domestic market, and I don't make the distinction between public and private, but there is a very robust procurement mechanism and disbursement or access mechanism. The difference was in COVID, it was for the whole population, so the scale was very different. But it was so successful because a very successful mechanism and distribution channel already existed for pediatric vaccines. So I don't think in the vaccine context it's an issue. But in the broader industry context, it boils down to the push and pull mechanisms, right? So push funding can happen to academia, again fragmented and low compared to the rest of the world. And push incentives like the recently announced RLI, the PLI schemes are definitely great incentives for industry. But the pull mechanisms are equally important. So again, an example, even in the vaccine context is, we just launched a pneumococcal 14-valent conjugate vaccine, but we're developing a 24-valent conjugate. Now, we don't know if that will be adopted or not, and if that will automatically be in the government procurement mechanism. Same goes for hepatitis A. So that will dictate quite directly what the demand for those products will be. So there's that gap that exists in the context of vaccines, but the pull mechanism for drugs and innovative drugs is much more important. Now, whether you create that through a procurement mechanism or through reimbursements by, broadening insurance. And the issue with that is our cost-benefit analysis is misleading because, we can cost deaths, but we don't really cost the loss of economic value, So when you plug that in, a lot of this insurance coverage will start to make sense when you start dealing with ongoing lifestyle diseases, cancer. There is going to be a cost of that. And that should drive these kind of pull mechanisms, as I call them.
And that's an important point that you make there, and I think that's instructive and important not just for industry to not always look at cost but also look at value that's being created, especially when you touch the lives of the average consumer, and that's an aspect that the government must also look at. And let me ask you this, K.T. Ramarao, in the context of the fact that governments around the world are dealing with limited fiscal space. I mean, each country at this point in time is going through its own set of challenges, whether you talk about the US healthcare system or you talk about the NHS. And given that context, what do you believe is the viable road ahead for reimbursements for public-private partnership to address the healthcare needs?
You're absolutely right. We are still a third world country, especially India, and each of the democratically elected governments in the states, such as ours, we have to balance both welfare and development. So therefore, coming to fiscal prudence, while you would want to do a lot more, as I was pointing out, again, when it comes to really doling out incentives, doling out reimbursements, it becomes a challenge. So the only way, in fact, if you ask me, we can incentivize anybody who's involved in high-risk capital, so to speak, because like Glenn was saying, he's been investing in innovation for the last 20 plus years. But they have not been still, I think that's what he said, they've still not been able to have a major breakthrough. So it takes a lot of, guts to achieve glory eventually, I guess. But the only thing, from a government perspective that we can do is create that enabling ecosystem. See, for instance, in Telangana, we've partnered with the World Economic Forum to create a Center for Industrial Revolution focused exclusively on life sciences. Now, what will this do? It will bring about multilateral collaboration opportunities where you can have different regions from across the world, learnings from them, like Hari was saying, maybe look at Indianized focus, in terms of drug development, so that you can even deliver at a much lower cost as opposed to trying to conquer the world. That's the one thing we can do. The second thing possibly we can also do as a government, like I said, instead of trying to boil the ocean, maybe identify few areas. Maybe say, okay, these are the challenges. Maybe only NCDs. And among NCDs, maybe focus only on, say, oncology or cardiovascular problems, and then go at it fully, as opposed to trying to do everything in one go. Maybe each state can be asked to focus on one area, each cluster can be asked to focus on one area, then we could possibly synergize and synthesize something that is truly good for India. Because if you want to do everything, then you'll be spreading your resources too thin and you won't be able to accomplish much. I think that sort of an approach.
And that has been a challenge across many sectors. But let's address the global environment at this point in time. And Satish Reddy, let me get you to comment on that. There are global macroeconomic headwinds that we are seeing today. We've moved from an era of zero interest rates now to higher for longer, and that will have its own implications as far as global growth is concerned. How do you see the global environment and India's role, the role of the Indian pharmaceutical industry within that space at this point in time? There's pressure points when it comes to pricing in the US, especially in the generic space. How are you seeing or reading the global signs at this point?
No, I think compared to other sectors, we probably are somewhat insulated, let me put it that way, the pharmaceutical sector. In the sense that units like medicines are required for use every day. Where it really causes a problem is, especially in the kind of ideas that we are discussing, venture capital getting into innovation, getting into high-risk areas and all that. Probably there's a little bit of effect towards that, compared to the core sectors. You brought up the issue of, the largest market, the US, and the pricing pressure. But this is a cycle which is not the first time. Yeah. We have seen this before. And again, there are multiple factors which lead to this at different points of time. The latest being, of course, the consolidation of, especially the buyers. That's what we have seen. And this is where, again, there'll be newer models which will keep emerging over a period of time. But then in this whole space, companies will also adapt. And they will also emerge out of that. So I don't see that as the most pressing concern at this point of time. Or you take India, for example. We just talked about it. It's a huge opportunity, for all the reasons that we talked about. And that's something that India will look at. Again, if you see the Indian companies' response, the large companies, listed companies' response to most of these areas have also been to diversify to other countries. That's what we have also shown. Certain Latin American countries, certain other countries where we see opportunities, and that will continue. Indian companies will continue to adapt. Indian companies will continue to innovate to get into newer areas, especially when it comes to products. And also we talked about biosimilars. That's an opportunity still. A big part of it that's playing out. The issue I think all of us have to deal with is if we have to be relevant in the long term. And again, I think the key thread that you see amongst all the speakers on the dais is about promoting innovation. Unless we do that, because according to me, I think we are missing the bus if we don't act quickly. Right? So the research-linked scheme is coming out soon. That's a good start. But when it comes to creating the ecosystem, I think lots more needs to be done when it comes to regulatory revamp. It should have been done 10 years ago, right, for things to happen. And when it comes to academic institutions and the encouragement and the collaboration that needs to happen, lots and lots to be done. I think we're just still scratching the surface. I think it's time for action. It's time to really get going on this. Otherwise we'll miss the bus.
Yes, and I think I'm hearing this from many, that this is the window of opportunity is small and we don't want to end up missing the bus this time around. Hari Bhartiya, let's talk about what we are seeing happen in the world today. There is a reshaping of globalization that's taking place. People are looking at diversification of supply chains, at alternate sites as far as manufacturing bases, etc. are concerned. Where do you believe India finds itself today? We have of course rolled out PLI schemes and so on and so forth. The pharmaceutical industry was the first to get a PLI scheme that the government announced. How strong do you believe our intervention is? How strong are we relatively poised to make good of this opportunity today?
Yeah. So there are two things which impacted supply chain. First was COVID, and then the Ukraine war. The impact of both, if you look at developed markets, US, let's say North America, Europe, they are deeply concerned about local capacity. They want to do huge onshoring now. And I'm personally involved because one of our US companies. So huge support from Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Health Services. They are giving grants to multiple companies to build capacity in Canada or US. Both the governments are doing it. Europe is doing it, depends on which country has what demand. But in North America, definitely, they want capacity to be as close to them as possible. As far as, you were in World Economic Forum, you heard about decoupling, China +1. Chinese were a very important suppliers of ingredients, intermediates, even starting to become contract research, they were a big supplier. Now, if you look at China +1, if there are other industries, maybe Mexico can be important, Vietnam, Philippines. But when it comes to pharmaceuticals, the options are limited. I think India stands to have a big advantage, I believe, because Indian talent, capacity, if you look at even today in US innovation, some of the products which are coming into the market, if you go back and look at where was the early stage work done, you will find it was either done in India or China. Because chemistry, they are the two leading countries. So I feel in the whatever decoupling that may happen, or people look at supply chain resilience, then India stands to have an advantage. But what Satish just said, there has been a slight bump because the investment in the biotech sector went down slightly in the beginning of this year or end of last year, but that's cyclical. It will pick up very fast.
You believe that it will start to pick up from here. Glenn, we are better poised. We have an advantage. We of course have legacy as well for us to be able to ride on. But what do you believe are the gaps at this point in time that we need to ensure that we fix to really make good on this opportunity?
Well, I think, India today is, as my other fellow speakers have said, India today is a powerhouse, right, in terms of the pharmaceutical industry. Particularly, we have a lot of excellence developed in a big part of the value chain, right from APIs, finished formulations, small molecule research. There are many areas where we've built a lot of capabilities, right? CDMOs, a lot of outsourcing services in our industry. So I think the one missing piece obviously is the higher end of the spectrum, which is the pure innovation, particularly on the biologics and biological side, right? High end, whether it's CAR-T technologies or bispecific, multispecific, or mRNA, lots of these high-end technologies which the rest of the world is pursuing pretty aggressively, we have a long way to go, right, as a country. So I think these are some of the areas we need to plug as we go forward to actually become, operate across the value chain and to truly dominate at a global stage. So I think if we're able to drive our innovation agenda, right, along with the help of the government, fix our regulatory systems, work hard on industry academic partnerships, and bring in intellectual capital, particularly people of Indian origin who are in the US, to come back to India and provide them an ecosystem to upskill the overall talent pool. I think India in the next decade can do extremely well in the innovation space. So it's a matter of moving up the value chain. India has done a lot of great things in generics and multiple areas.
Hand on your heart. For how long have we been talking about exactly this stuff?
A really long time, I can tell you. A really long time.
But do you feel hopeful, confident? I mean, of being able to? Are we at the cusp of moving forward on some of this stuff?
I mean, innovation is a journey of a lifetime. It takes a long time, right, for anyone or any individual, any company to actually be globally world-class innovation, right?
We just heard the Moderna story, right?
That's
I mean, innovation, I understand that you need to have an ecosystem and so on and so forth, but we can't be sitting here and having the same conversation year after year. Surely something has to give.
That's true, but I think the building blocks have to be put in place, right, to be successful. It's not something that you can wish for and it's going to happen, right? I mean, I think the country has made a lot of progress and continues to make a lot of progress, right? And I think as the pharmaceutical industry also, as some of the leading companies get bigger in scale and are able to dominate the value chain in other areas like generics, branded generics, their ability to put more capital into innovation also increases, and to take more risks and take some bets on innovation. So it's a factor of many different attributes which have to go together to move up the value chain.
No, I agree with you that it requires that ecosystem effect to kick in. But Mahima, since we are talking about opportunities at this point in time, partnerships, is that going to be a crucial way for the Indian pharmaceutical industry to move up the value chain at this point in time? How do you look at that, especially in light of your own experience?
No, absolutely. I think it's been historically pretty crucial, particularly when it comes to novel products. And it's certainly a way to have, address the capital issue, address the risk issue. So partnerships going forward, I think, are going to be extremely key, whether it's in vaccines or biosimilars or therapeutics. But they already exist and they're increasing, particularly in novel products. Would those partnerships result in more access in our country, or again, is it just going to be much more of a global access opportunity? Is a different story. Yeah.
Nandini?
I think one of the things Indian industry needs to do is actually continue to focus on quality. The FDA and other global regulators have started, re-auditing every one of us. And I think when we talk to other people, they've all become tougher. Right, so they're raising the bar in terms of quality and process and even digitization and expectations of that. And I think as an industry, that's one of the things that we have to continue to work on. It's a journey. It will take 23 years or longer, but I think we can do that.
And Nandini, you've touched upon a very important issue, and I think that this is an issue that at this point in time, Indian industry is also grappling with front and center, and that is the issue of quality. Forget the 483s that come regularly the way of many companies, and those are dealt with. But on the issue that we've seen happen in the last few months with WHO warnings and so on and so forth, is there a confidence erosion at this point in time, and what do you believe the response needs to be to arrest that?
I do think as a domestic industry as well, we need to improve our state level quality organizations because it is a state subject. So that's sort of one. But I think globally, even as we are all regulated by the global regulators, and we have seen them become tougher, so we have to respond accordingly.
Mahima?
So I wouldn't say there's been an erosion of trust. I mean, we have over 500 FDA-approved facilities in the country, and most of them for complex products. So there always will be specific instances, and I think that stems from some inconsistencies on even our regulators' part to, kind of apply these requirements in a much more consistent fashion. So that harmonization on oversight is required. And obviously, it's they're sort of the custodians to ensure that industry is not making trade-offs between quality and, exigencies related to demand. So they really need to be true custodians and have harmonization. But I really wouldn't point to any erosion of trust because we continue to have a very robust, thriving industry.
Yeah.
I mean, supplying to regulated markets.
No, absolutely. And on the issue of harmonization of regulation, and I think that is a big ask at this point in time as well. But on addressing the domestic regulatory capability issue, capacity issue, Satish Reddy, that is a challenge that also needs to be addressed, especially if we aspire to grow this business and grow this industry manyfold.
No, it's absolutely, it is a necessary thing, and it's the most important thing at this point of time. I mean, from all angles, right? So forget about just innovation part of it, where we are seeking faster approvals and building more capabilities. But I think in terms of the core regulatory capacity, because again, I think here we have the issue of the center and the state, right? So because there's also a state regulator and there's also a central regulator. At all levels, I think a whole host of issues need to be looked into to ensure that the confidence, especially not just for for the pharma company's point of view, but it's ultimately the patient's point of view, the consumers. Finally, they need to get the confidence. And again, like, it's an important thing because it needs a concerted effort from all angles. It starts with the Drugs and Cosmetic Act, right? So that itself needs to be amended because what we have is in place is something that started way back in the 60s. There needs to be coordination among the states so that we have a, I would say a concerted way by which you have a uniform system. It can't be that it's like one state has a certain interpretation and implementation of the law compared to the rest of the states. And also, more than anything else, the enforcement. I think that's the key thing that needs to be done because again, there are certain states which probably are lax, certain states which are not. All these things need to come onto it, and again, I would say systems to get online, more uniform, so that there's enough coordination. All these are factors that need to be done, but most important thing is what you just said. In terms of building capacity and capabilities within the regulatory system, I think that needs a lot more to be done.
KTR, let me come to you on this issue. A, the coordination between the central regulator as well as the state regulator. B, beefing up capability and capacity at the state level because, the licensing, etc. is done at the state level as well. In your experience, how are you going about addressing this issue since you have the aspiration of positioning Telangana and Hyderabad as a hub for pharmaceutical and biotechnology?
I think more and more decentralization. In fact, we've obviously been in consultation with many of the international authorities, including FDA as well, and the drug controllers in India as well. So more and more decentralization. But if you really look around, 28 states, there are hardly 3 or 4 states where predominantly, the business is done. So I think these 3 or 4 states together with Government of India can work out a model which I think is working reasonably well so far, but it further can be decentralized and further can be made better. But having said that, Shireen, I think the way forward, if you ask me, because when you were putting Glenn on a spot saying, how long do we have to have this conversation? I think patience is a virtue. And you also have to understand one thing, there isn't enough reward for an Indian entrepreneur to take big risks. That is a fact. And as long as we don't recognize it, how much ever we put these guys in the spot and, keep asking those questions, the fact is, we're a very price sensitive country. We can't have overpriced drugs. At the same time, we also cannot push these guys to innovate when there isn't enough reward there. So if Glenn is constantly investing for 20 plus years and there isn't light at the end of the tunnel, I don't think he'll continue
No,
to do.
you're absolutely right. And I wasn't putting Glenn on the spot at all. And I think it comes back to the point that Mahima had made about the domestic market and you know, building up the domestic market. And at the end of the day, each one of them is answerable to shareholders, so they do need to return on capital. But let me ask each one of you about the things that you're excited about. And Mahima, let me start by asking you the move towards digitalization. You know, not just from a services point of view, but also internally as companies. You know, what excites you on that front? What are the milestones that you're hoping to achieve there? And even as far as R&D efforts are concerned, again, what are you excited about? What do you feel confident of?
If I can be completely honest, I'm much more excited about the R&D efforts than the digitization efforts, particularly in our line of work. And I think on the R&D / pipeline side, the opportunities on the mRNA platform continue to excite us, both in the vaccine and therapeutic space. I think areas in the sort of biosimilars space related to monoclonal antibodies and other complex therapies that may involve vector-based manufacturing and so on, that excites us. And on our specialty injectable side, obviously, you know, any support of the generics business, but we were just discussing how that's quite complicated as well. But maybe moving up the value chain in fermentation-based APIs, high-potency intermediates, and peptide sort of based APIs. I think those are the sorts of things we remain excited by.
Since you're most excited about what's happening on the R&D front, over the next 5 years, what is the kind of spend that you expect on R&D as a percentage of where you are today?
So we already are amongst the highest R&D spenders as a percentage of sales. So it's around 15 to 16%. I don't anticipate that going up because of obviously the leveling up of the COVID-related business versus the others, so I don't think it'll be extraordinary. But if the opportunity arises, then we'll look at it as a standalone investment, and that won't be linked to sales. It might be just a disproportionate investment, as we've done sometimes in the past. But yeah.
Okay, Nandini, what are you most excited about? And give me a trajectory of where you see R&D spends for you.
I think for us, actually, so I'm going to say I'm most excited about the digitization, because I think as an industry, we've been a bit slow to embrace digitization, but I think now, and especially in some of, you know, like our colleagues here, they've done a great job in actually making digitization come alive in the factories, and that's something I'd like to do much, much more of.
Glenn?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I mean, India, you know, the prospects for India and leading Indian companies to be truly the pharmacy of the world is just, we're just at the infancy. And I think the next decade, Indian companies, especially the leading companies, will continue to scale their global platforms, right? Global businesses across generics, branded generics, specialty products in most parts of the world. So that's a great trajectory we're on, right? And the next levers of growth, I think will come from innovation, right, for the leading Indian companies. So it's a great journey ahead of us for the leading Indian companies.
So let me, you know, I talked about partnerships, but let me also ask each one of you this, and Glenn, I'll start by asking you, given the fact that everyone's fairly clear that there is a limited window of opportunity at this point in time to be able to capitalize on, is this going to be a time where we see aggressive moves being made, aggressive bets being taken by Indian companies to go out shopping at this point in time? Is that something that you're considering, for instance?
I think partnerships, you know, we do partnerships across the board, right? For example,